I was still in high school. And I had come to New York, and I was hanging out with Lester Del Rey and Algis Budrys and Harry Harrison and all these people who belonged to the Hydra Club. The Hydra Club was a writers' drinking and schmoozing society. They would get together once a week or once every 2 weeks in Jay Stanton's apartment, and which is down on First Avenue. And they would stand around and they would just talk. And there would be L. Sprague de Camp. There's a great story told about L. Sprague de Camp. L. Sprague de Camp is supposed to be this great writer of funny stories. He's one of the great. Everybody says, "Oh, he writes very funny stories," and he does. And they told me that one night they noticed Sprague, who's a tall, slim, very ascetic gentleman with a mustache. I mean, he looks like something out of a Louis Auchincloss novel, or the late George Apley. I mean, he really looks. He's an elegant, well turned out man who speaks very precisely, very academically. And he had a pad and pencil, and he would stand behind a group of people who were talking, and he would be writing things down. So finally, after about 3 hours, people jumped him. They said, "Come on, Sprague, what the hell are you writing?" And they looked. And he had been writing down all of the funny things that people said because he wanted to figure out how humor worked. He didn't understand.
He was trying to analyze.
He was trying to analyze. He was trying to dissect it and put it. I mean, that's the kind of anyhow. So Hubbard was there. Now Hubbard was legendary among the pulp writers. He'd been writing pulp stories for years. Most of his biography was made up. It was, he created his own mythology about himself. But one of the things that was true about him was that he was one of the very first writers ever to have an electric typewriter. And he had one of those huge original
IBM Selectric? Before that.
I think it was even before an IBM Selectric. It was something like a big L.C. Smith. I mean, it was just gigantic. It was, if you tied it around someone's feet, you could put them in a bay and no one would ever find them. Forget about it. So, he tried to figure out a way to write faster because you were only being paid a penny a word, 2 cents a word, 3 cents a word. That was the max. That's all you got. The best markets paid 3 cents a word when you caught them. Didn't you know that?
No. They paid by the word.
They paid by the word, of course. That's the way I wrote. When I started writing in 1955, 56, I got paid a penny a word. I would sit up all night. I'd write a 3,000-word short story. I'd take it in the next day to Ziff Davis Publishing at 1 Park Avenue, and they would read it right on the spot, and Paul Fremont would say, "Okay, I'll buy it and give me a voucher for $30. And I would take it down. I'd go and pay my rent. I was living in a $10 a week room. So $30 was 3 weeks. Yeah. But then in those days you could get a spaghetti dinner at Ronzoni's on Times Square. I was working on Times Square. I was working at the Broadway Bookshop between the Victoria and Astor theaters. It was wonderful. That's when I got to see Gwen Verdon naked.
This alone is worth the price of admission.
No.
Woo!
Trust me, you don't want to go there.
Okay.
So I worked the shift. It was great. Broadway in those days was great because I worked the 6 o'clock in the evening shift till 3 in the morning. And after midnight was when all the interracial couples came out, was when all the real kookaboos and cadotes came out. It was a great time.
Oh, man, that must have been wonderful.
It was a wonderful time. And right across the street was the Ronzoni Spaghetti House. And you could get a spaghetti dinner with 2 meatballs and bread and coffee or iced tea for $1. And it was, and I would eat there every night. And down the street pizza was 15 cents a slice. Wow. And I would go over to the flea circus and listen to Tiny Tim play his mandolin, except he wasn't called Tiny Tim then. He had another name.
And he was just starting?
He was just starting, and
I believe.
It was great times. Oh, I was telling you about Hubbard with the typewriter.
Right.
To become faster, because he was only being paid a penny a word, 2 cents a word, 3 cents a word, he had attached to the wall, he worked against a wall, had a little table set against the wall. On the wall behind the table where the typewriter sat, he had installed one of those spindles that butchers have the brown paper on, a roll of brown paper.
Oh, yeah.
And he would roll the brown paper, the butcher's paper, into the typewriter and start typing. And when it got too much, he would rip it off with a T-square. He would rip it off and throw it behind him and keep typing. And that's how he would take the manuscript in. And that way he didn't have to stop to put paper in the typewriter.
So he's cranking at that point.
He was really cranking it, but he wrote a lot. He wrote not just science fiction, but he wrote westerns, he wrote mysteries, he wrote all kinds of stuff. But the novels, the fantasy novels, the Slaves Asleep, the Triton that he did were wonderful, wonderful stuff. And Slan is Van Vogt. I'm sorry, Slan is Van Vogt. Slan is not Hubbard. Hubbard did a Final Blackout, Slaves Asleep, the Triton, and about 24 others, but they're really well worth reading. Fear, he did a book called Fear.
What's that about?
Fear is the first psychological horror novel. It's literally about fear. He did one called Death's Deputy. He read somewhere that insurance adjusters had a table where they had lists of people to whom accidents don't happen, but everybody around them have accidents. And he called the guy a debt's deputy. And he tells this, it's a wonderful story about this guy who wanders through life, and all around him people are dying and falling off buildings and all this shit. A beautiful book. He also did one called Typewriter in the Sky, where this guy realizes that his life is being written by God in a dirty bathrobe, sitting on the edge of a bed with a typewriter. So, well, I got a mind full of this crap.
But it's incredible to hear all these connections. I don't think people know.
He must have had a dozen pseudonyms, and the ones that the Kilkenny cats were written on the name Kurt von Ratchen. So I'm at this evening, and I'm just a high school kid, and I've come in from Cleveland, Ohio, for Christ's sake, and I'm in among the giants, for God's sakes, and I'm just sort of sitting there quietly, and Lester Del Rey, who was a very well-known writer, and subsequently became Del Rey Books and blah 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 blah. Lester, in his childhood, had been a stump minister like Marjoe Gortner. He had been a revivalist. He was a child evangelist. And so Ron was complaining that he was breaking his ass writing, and he was never going to get, they would find him slumped over the typewriter one day. This is how, because there was no annuity, there's no insurance, there's no nothing, and you can't keep it up forever. I mean, I've been at it for 50 years, for God's sakes. I'm lucky still to be able to write. And these guys were sort of in sight of that, and they knew that they had to do something, and Ron said there's got to be a better way to make money. So Lester says, start a religion. That's the way to do it. Start a religion. And he said, and Ron said, yeah, not a bad. Now, what kind of a religion? Well, one guy contributed Reich's Orgon box. Another one came up with engrams, which were forgotten, lost memory, or whatever it was. And sure enough, Ron went ahead and he cobbled up Dianetics, and he wrote this book
because it has a little bit of all of that.
All of that stuff in it, and it took off, and he became